The bitter cold of the winter night bit through Emma's thin sweater as she huddled in the corner of an abandoned cafe entrance. The streets of New York weren't kind to the homeless, especially not to a young woman alone. She had learned that the hard way. People passed by her without a glance, their expensive coats wrapped tightly around them as if they could shield themselves from the sight of her misery. Some clutched their designer handbags closer, as though her very existence was a threat. Others scrolled through their phones, avoiding eye contact. She used to be one of them, someone who believed homelessness was something that only happened to people who made bad choices. But life had proven her wrong. Welcome to a world of untold stories and shocking truths. Some secrets change lives forever, and this one just might. Let's begin. Emma had lost everything. Her mother's sudden illness had drained every penny of their savings. When her mother passed, the hospital bills didn't disappear. Instead, they crushed her under a mountain of debt. Then came the eviction notice. The job she once had couldn't cover both rent and her mother's medical expenses. And when she couldn't keep up, the world moved on without her. Now every night was a battle between exhaustion and fear. Her stomach growled, but she ignored it. Hunger was a constant companion now, and she had made peace with it. That was until a black car, a sleek, expensive one, slowed down in front of her. She froze. It wasn't unusual for cars to stop at the traffic light nearby, but something about this one felt different. The tinted window rolled down, revealing a man in an expensive tailored suit. He wasn't just rich, he was powerful. She could tell by the way he looked at her, as if he was evaluating her, deciding something important. "Get in." Emma stiffened. His voice was deep, smooth, and completely unreadable. Her instinct screamed at her to run. Rich men in expensive suits didn't stop for homeless women in the dead of winter unless they wanted something. And in her experience, what they wanted was never good. She clutched her tattered hoodie closer. "No thanks," the man sighed, tilting his head. "I have a proposal for you," he said. "One that could change your life forever." She scoffed. "I don't do that kind of work, if that's what you're asking." His lips curled into a smirk. "That's not what I meant." He gestured toward the passenger seat. 5 minutes, hear me out. If you don't like what I have to say, I'll drop you off anywhere you want." Emma hesitated. This was crazy. Beyond crazy. But the wind howled through the streets, and the hunger clawing at her stomach made it hard to think straight. 5 minutes in a heated car wouldn't hurt, would it? Before she could change her mind, she stepped forward, pulled open the door and slid inside. The scent of leather and expensive cologne filled her lungs as she sank into the plush seat. Warmth wrapped around her like a forgotten luxury. The man beside her pressed a button, and the tinted window rolled up, sealing them off from the outside world. "Emma Carter." She turned sharply. "How do you know my name?" He smirked, unfazed by her shock. "I know a lot about you." Her heart pounded. Who was this man? "I have people who keep an eye on the city," he continued, swirling the amber liquid in his crystal glass. "I've seen you out here for the past few months." Emma clenched her fists. The idea of being watched made her skin crawl. "Why? What do you want?" The man leaned back, adjusting the cuff of his jacket. "I need a wife." Emma choked on her own breath. Did he just say, "A fake wife," he clarified, as if that made it any less insane. "For exactly 1 year. In return, I'll give you everything, food, clothes, a place to live. And when the year is over, you'll walk away with $1 million. Emma stared at him. Was he drunk? Or just messing with her? "This is some kind of joke, right?" she said. "Some sick game rich guys play when they're bored?" The man's expression didn't change. "I don't play games." Her pulse pounded. "Why on earth would you need a fake wife?" The man exhaled slowly, pinching the bridge of his nose like this conversation exhausted him. "My grandfather's will. If I don't marry within the next 2 months, I lose everything." Emma blinked. "This can't be real. So you want me to pretend to love you?" she asked, her voice dripping with skepticism. "Not love," he said with a smirk. "Just marriage, appearances. We attend events together, smile for the cameras, and live under the same roof. No real relationship, no strings attached, just a business transaction." Emma exhaled slowly. This was insane. But what other choice did she have? She had nothing, no future, no safety, no way out. And you're offering me $1 million, she repeated, trying to process it. $1 million, he confirmed. At the end of the contract. Until then, you'll live like a queen. Emma's fingers trembled. This wasn't just a deal, it was a lifeline. Her lips parted as she whispered the one word that would change her life forever. Okay. The moment Emma said, okay, the air in the car shifted. Alexander didn't react with relief or excitement. Instead, he simply nodded, as if she had just agreed to sign for a package, not a marriage contract. Good, he said, tapping something on his phone. Within seconds, the car pulled away from the curb. She swallowed hard. Where are we going? You'll... See, he replied without looking at her. Emma pressed her back against the seat, trying to process what had just happened. She had said yes. She had agreed to marry a man she didn't know, to pretend to be his wife, all for $1 million. It felt like something out of a ridiculous movie, but for her, it was real. The alternative was spending another night starving, in the cold, another night waiting for a miracle that would never come. The car weaved through the city, past towering skyscrapers and glowing billboards, until it finally pulled into an underground parking lot. When the door opened, she hesitated before stepping out, suddenly aware of how out of place she looked. Her clothes were dirty, her hair unkempt, her shoes barely holding together. But Alexander didn't even glance at her as he strode toward a private elevator, expecting her to follow. She hesitated before stepping inside, the doors sliding shut behind them. The numbers climbed higher and higher, the air between them thick with silence. Emma forced herself to breathe. So, how many fake wives have you hired before? He smirked, still facing forward. You're the first. Great. Love, being the test subject. His expression didn't change. You needed an opportunity. I needed a wife. We both get something out of this. The elevator chimed, and the doors slid open to reveal the most insane penthouse Emma had ever seen. She stepped out cautiously, her breath catching in her throat. The floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a breathtaking view of the city skyline, the lights stretching out like stars. Everything inside gleamed: marble floors, chandeliers, leather furniture that probably cost more than an entire apartment. This is your place? Her voice wavered. Alexander loosened his tie and set his phone down on a sleek black table. For now, it's yours too. Emma turned to him sharply. You keep saying for now. Because, Emma, this is a contract. You don't own anything here. You'll be living here under my name, wearing clothes I provide, attending events, by my side. And when our deal is over, you'll leave. Something about the way he said it made her stomach tighten. Of course, this wasn't real, she knew that, but hearing it laid out so plainly made her feel temporary. She looked down at her clothes, suddenly hyper-aware of how she must have looked standing there in rags. Alexander sighed and checked his watch. Tomorrow you'll go shopping. A new wardrobe, a stylist, anything necessary to make you look the part. Emma raised an eyebrow. So, a full Cinderella makeover? If that's how you want to see it. She crossed her arms. What if I don't want to be your perfectly polished fake wife? His lips curved into the faintest smirk. You already agreed to be. Her stomach twisted. She had walked into this willingly, but the reality of what she had agreed to was only just starting to sink in. The next morning she sat stiffly at a massive dining table, staring at a steaming cup of coffee. A man in a sharp suit, Alexander's lawyer, sat across from her, placing a thick contract between them. This outlines the terms of your arrangement, he explained. Once signed, this marriage will be legally binding for 1 year. Emma's hands trembled slightly as she flipped through the pages. There were rules. So many rules: no falling in love, no interference with business matters, no speaking to the press, no contact with the media, divorce after 1 year, non-negotiable. At the bottom, the final clause was in bold: $1 million to be deposited upon divorce finalization. She clenched the pen in her hand. This was it. No turning back. She signed. That evening she found herself wrapped in a silk gown, walking alongside Alexander as flashing cameras surrounded them. They were at a high-profile charity gala, the first public appearance of Emma Grayson, fiancé of a billionaire. The murmurs from the crowd, the whispers of curiosity, the way Alexander wrapped an arm around her waist like he had done it 1,000 times before, it all felt too surreal. The cameras clicked. "Mr. Grayson, who is the mystery? Woman? When's the wedding?" Emma forced a smile as Alexander turned toward the reporters and said, "This is Emma, my fiancée." The words sent a shiver down her spine. She had played along, smiled for the pictures, nodded at the right moments. But as they drove back home in silence, her hands gripped her gown, her mind racing. This was real now. She was Emma Grayson, billionaire's wife-to-be, and there was no turning back. Emma stared out of the car window as the city lights blurred past. The flashes from the gala still danced in her vision, and the weight of Alexander's arm around her waist lingered in her mind. She had played her role, smiled when needed, let him lead her through the whirlwind of flashing cameras and questioning eyes. But now, sitting in silence beside him in the dim glow of the car's interior, reality pressed down on her. She was engaged to a man she didn't love, marrying a man she barely knew. For money. Alexander sat beside her, scrolling through his phone, like nothing had happened, as if tonight had been just another business meeting. Maybe for him it was. This was a transaction, after all, a contract. But to the rest of the world, she was now Emma Grayson, fiancée of a billionaire. She let out a slow breath, trying to settle the unease creeping up her spine. "You did well tonight," Alexander finally said, breaking the silence. Emma turned to him, surprised. "I smiled and didn't trip in heels. Hardly an achievement." His lips twitched, the closest thing to amusement she had seen from him. "Public appearances matter. You handled the attention well." "I'm used to people staring," she muttered. "Just not for the right reasons." He glanced at her then, a flicker of something in his eyes, curiosity maybe, but he didn't press. Instead, he set his phone down and leaned back against the leather seat, the tension in his shoulders finally easing. Emma hesitated before speaking again. "Doesn't it bother you, lying to the whole world?" His expression didn't change. "Business is built on perception. People believe what they want to believe." "That's not an answer." He turned to her fully this time, his gaze sharp. "I don't owe the world the truth about my personal life. As far as they're concerned, we're in love. That's all. That matters." Emma looked away, her fingers gripping the folds of her gown. He spoke about love as if it were just another business deal, another chess piece to be moved at his convenience. She wanted to ask if he had ever been in love, real love, but she already knew the answer. The car pulled into the underground parking lot of the Grayson Tower. By the time they reached the penthouse, exhaustion had settled deep in Emma's bones. She had barely slept the night before, and the weight of everything she had just stepped into felt heavier with each passing second. Alexander shrugged off his jacket and set it aside, loosening his tie as he walked to the bar. He poured himself a drink but didn't offer one to her, not that she expected him to. Emma hovered near the entryway, unsure what to do. "So, how does this work?" He raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" She gestured vaguely around the penthouse. "Us, living together. Do I get a schedule? Should I be practicing my fake loving wife act?" He smirked, taking a sip of his drink. "I doubt you'll need practice. Just follow my lead." Emma folded her arms. "Do we even sleep in the same room?" Alexander set his glass down, studying her. "No. You'll stay in the guest room. As long as you show up to events when required and behave accordingly, I don't care what you do in your free time." A strange feeling settled in her chest. She should have been relieved. He wasn't going to push for more than what they had agreed to. But something about how easily he dismissed her, how effortlessly he compartmentalized their arrangement, left a bitter taste in her mouth. She nodded, not trusting herself to say more. Without another word, she turned and walked toward the hallway, finding the guest room that was now hers. The moment she stepped inside, she exhaled. The room was beautiful, far more luxurious than anything she had ever known. The bed was massive, the sheets impossibly soft beneath her fingertips. Still, she felt like an imposter in this world. Sitting on the edge of the bed, she stared down at her hands, her nails still chipped and rough despite the expensive manicure. she had been given earlier. This was a game to Alexander, a calculated move in his empire. But to her this was survival. She pulled her knees up to her chest, resting her chin against them. 1 year, she just had to make it through 1 year. But deep down, something told her. This was only the beginning. The first morning in the penthouse felt surreal. Sunlight filtered through the massive windows, casting golden hues over the silk sheets as Emma stirred awake. For a moment, she forgot where she was. The mattress beneath her wasn't a cold pavement, and the scent in the air wasn't the city's. Filth but fresh linen and expensive cologne lingering in the air. Then reality settled in. She wasn't here because she belonged. She was here because of a deal. A knock on the door made her jolt upright. "Breakfast in 10, Alexander's voice came through the door, firm and detached. No good morning. No warmth. Just an instruction. Emma sighed, running a hand through her hair before dragging herself out of bed. She made her way to the dining area, where Alexander sat at the head of the table, reading the news on a sleek tablet. The spread before her was overwhelming. Fresh fruit, eggs, smoked salmon, pastries, things she hadn't tasted in months. She hesitated. She had spent so much time fighting for scraps that the idea of having plenty felt foreign. Alexander glanced up, noticing her still standing. "Sit." Emma bit the inside of her cheek but obeyed, sinking into the chair across from him. She reached for a piece of toast cautiously, feeling his gaze on her. "You should eat properly. You'll be in the public eye from now on. Looking malnourished won't fit the role." She froze mid-bite. The casual way he said it, like she was just another part of his brand, rubbed her the wrong way. Emma set her toast down, looking at him. "I know you could just say good morning like a normal person." He smirked but didn't respond. The silence stretched between them before he finally set his tablet down. "I have a schedule for you." Of course he did. "You'll be attending a luncheon this afternoon," he continued. "Some of my business partners' wives will be there. It'll be your introduction into their circle." Emma's stomach twisted. A room full of wealthy, polished women. She would stick out like a sore thumb. And what exactly am I supposed to do there? Alexander took a sip of his coffee. Smile. Make conversation. Let them believe this marriage is real. She exhaled through her nose. Right. Lie. His gaze flickered to her, unreadable. Call it what you want. But those women hold influence and their opinions matter. You need their approval. Emma clenched her jaw. It wasn't just about playing wife. It was about fitting into his world. Alexander stood adjusting his cufflinks. Our car will pick you up in 2 hours. Be ready. And just like that he walked away, leaving Emma alone in the massive dining room, surrounded by food she suddenly had no appetite for. The boutique was nothing short of intimidating. Emma stood stiffly as a team of stylists fluttered around her, draping dresses over her frame, fixing her hair, slipping heels onto her feet like she was a doll they were designing. The mirrors reflected a version of herself she barely recognized, her once dull eyes now framed with expensive makeup, her tattered hoodie replaced with a tailored dress worth more than she had ever held in her hands. "You clean up well," one of the stylists murmured approvingly. Emma forced a polite smile. When the car pulled up to the restaurant, her stomach twisted. This was it. The driver opened the door and she stepped out, the sound of her heels foreign against the pavement. Inside, the restaurant buzzed with soft conversation and the clinking of expensive glasses. And then she saw them, the women she was supposed to impress. Seated at a round table were 5 women, polished, poised, their designer handbags resting beside them like status symbols. They barely glanced at her as she approached. One of them, a striking blonde with an air of importance, eyed her with mild curiosity. "So, you're Alexander's fiancée?" Emma forced a smile. "Emma, it's nice to meet you." The blonde leaned back, sipping her wine. Interesting choice. A few of the others exchanged glances, barely hiding their skepticism. Emma's heart pounded. They were testing her. She sat, trying to mimic their effortless grace, though she felt out of place in every possible way. The conversation flowed, mostly revolving around things she knew nothing about. Luxury vacations, investment portfolios, exclusive parties. So Emma, the blonde, Madeline, said, tapping her manicured fingers against her glass. Tell us, how did you and Alexander meet? Emma swallowed. She should have expected this. She forced a soft smile. It was unexpected. I wasn't exactly looking for love, but somehow it found me. Madeline arched a brow. How romantic. And what exactly were you doing before you met him? The subtle sharpness in her tone wasn't lost on Emma. She was digging. Emma's pulse quickened, but she refused to stumble. Something much different from this world. Madeline smirked like she had already drawn her own conclusions. The rest of the luncheon was just as exhausting. Smiling, nodding, dodging questions that would unravel the truth. By the time she slid into the car to leave, she felt like she had run a marathon. When she arrived back at the penthouse, she kicked off her heels, sinking onto the couch with a deep sigh. Alexander entered a moment later, glancing at her lazily. How was it? Emma groaned, throwing her head back against the cushions. Your friends' wives are terrifying. He smirked. I take it they weren't welcoming? Oh, they were polite, she said, eyes closed. Polite in a, we're watching you and waiting for you to fail kind of way. Alexander chuckled, sitting across from her. They'll warm up, or they won't. It doesn't matter. Emma turned her head to look at him. You don't actually care, do you? He shrugged. I care about what benefits me. She shook her head with a soft laugh. That's the most Alexander answer ever. For the first time, his smirk faded just slightly, his gaze lingering on her longer than usual. Emma shifted under his stare. What? He didn't answer right away. Then, with a slight tilt of his head, he murmured, Nothing. You just surprise me sometimes. Her breath caught for a second, but before she could say anything, he stood and left the room, leaving her with a strange flutter in her chest she didn't know how to ignore. She wasn't sure what had just happened, but for the first time since this arrangement started, she felt something shift between them, and that scared her more than anything else. The next few weeks passed in a blur of carefully curated appearances, controlled conversations, and the constant pressure of pretending. Emma was getting better at playing her role. She learned how to smile just enough, nod at the right times, and avoid questions that might expose the truth. But no matter how much she adjusted, she could feel the weight of scrutiny pressing down on her. Madeline and the others were still watching her closely, waiting for cracks in the illusion. The public had fully embraced the news of Alexander's engagement, the media covering their every appearance with fascination. To the outside world, they were the picture-perfect couple. Alexander Grayson, the untouchable billionaire, and his stunning, mysterious fiancée. But inside the walls of the penthouse, things were far from perfect. Alexander was distant. Their interactions were brief, mostly revolving around what was required for appearances. When they were in public, his touch was effortless, his gaze filled with a manufactured affection that convinced even her at times. But the moment they stepped out of the spotlight, the warmth vanished. He spent most nights in his office, his mind buried in business deals and late-night calls. Emma barely saw him unless it was for an event. And even then, their conversations were purely functional. She told herself it didn't matter. This wasn't real, but it was starting to feel empty. One night, after another exhausting charity gala, she returned to the penthouse feeling drained. The moment she stepped inside, she kicked off her heels and let out a frustrated sigh. You should pace yourself, Alexander's voice came from the kitchen. She turned to see him pouring himself a drink. His tie loosened, the top button of his shirt undone. He looked as put together as ever, but there was something tired in his eyes. Emma scoffed, crossing her arms. You say that like I have a choice. He leaned against the counter, studying her. You always have a choice. She let out a dry laugh. Right. Because choosing to be publicly scrutinized every day is exactly what I dreamed of. Alexander didn't respond right away. He simply watched her, as if debating whether to say what was on his mind. Finally, he exhaled and set his glass down. You did well tonight, he said. Emma arched an eyebrow. That almost sounded like a compliment. He smirked slightly. Take it however you want. She leaned against the couch, watching him. Do you ever get tired of this? Tired of what? Pretending, she said, gesturing around them, of being this version of yourself that the world expects. His smirk faded. "I don't pretend," he said simply. Emma tilted her head. "I think you do." He didn't say anything, but the flicker in his eyes told her she had hit something deeper than she expected. She wasn't sure why she pushed. Maybe it was because she was tired too. Tired of pretending that this arrangement was simple. Tired of acting like she wasn't losing herself in a world she didn't belong to. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them was heavy, something unspoken lingering just beneath the surface. Then Alexander broke eye contact and downed the rest of his drink. "Get some rest, Emma. Tomorrow is another long day." And just like that, the moment was gone. Days blurred into weeks and Emma continued to play her part. But something was shifting. She noticed the way Alexander's gaze lingered on her longer than before, the way he instinctively reached for her hand at events, even when no cameras were watching, the way he spoke to her, not as a business transaction, but as someone who was beginning to see her. One night after returning from a dinner event, Emma was standing by the window, staring out at the city lights. She didn't hear him approach until he was right beside her. "The view is better from the rooftop," he said. She turned to him, surprised. "I thought you didn't have time for things like that." He gave a small shrug. "Maybe I do tonight." Curiosity got the better of her, and she followed him to the private rooftop terrace. The air was crisp, and the city stretched out endlessly beneath them. For the first time in weeks, there were no cameras, no expectations. Just silence. Emma wrapped her arms around herself. "I forget how beautiful the city is from up here." Alexander leaned against the railing, his expression unreadable. "I forget too." She looked at him then, really looked at him. In the moonlight, with his usual mask of indifference softened, he looked different. "Tell me something," she said. He glanced at her. "What? What were you like before all of this?" His jaw tensed slightly, as if the question caught him off guard. "Before all of what?" "Before you became this." She gestured toward him, the suit, the empire, the calculated detachment. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he let out a slow breath. "I didn't have a choice." Emma frowned. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, then met her gaze. "My father built this company. He was a ruthless businessman, and he raised me to be the same. There was no room for weakness, no room for failure. By the time I was old enough to understand what I wanted, it was too late. I was already molded into the person I had to be." Emma stared at him, realizing for the first time that Alexander Grayson, the man who seemed untouchable, unshakable, wasn't as in control as he wanted the world to believe. "You don't have to be him," she said softly. Something flickered in his eyes, something raw and unguarded. But then just as quickly he looked away. "You should get some rest," he said, his voice quieter than before. Emma nodded, but as she walked away, she couldn't shake the feeling that tonight, for the first time, she had seen a glimpse of the real Alexander Grayson. And she wasn't sure what scared her more, the fact that she had seen it or the fact that she wanted to see more. Emma tried to ignore the shift between them, but it was impossible. It was in the way Alexander's eyes lingered when he thought she wasn't looking, the way their conversations stretched longer than necessary, and the way silence between them no longer felt empty. She knew this wasn't part of the deal. The contract was clear. This was business, a performance, nothing more. But lately the lines between real and pretend were starting to blur. She told herself it didn't matter. That no matter how many stolen moments they shared, this wasn't real. But when she woke up in the middle of the night, the city silent outside, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was lying to herself. Sleep wouldn't come, so she wandered into the kitchen, expecting to be alone. She wasn't. Alexander was sitting at the counter, sleeves rolled up, a glass of whiskey in front of him. He looked up as she entered, his gaze unreadable. "Couldn't sleep." Emma shook her head. "You?" He gave a dry chuckle, swirling the amber liquid in his glass. "I don't sleep much." She hesitated before stepping closer. "Why not?" His eyes flickered to hers, and for a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he sighed. Too many thoughts, too much noise. She understood that feeling all too well. Without thinking, she slid onto the stool beside him. "Want to talk about it?" He arched a brow. "You offering to be my therapist now?" She smirked. I charge extra for emotional labor. He exhaled, a soft laugh shaking his head. But there was something different about his expression, less guarded, more open. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, without looking at her, he murmured, "Do you regret saying yes?" The question caught her off guard. Emma blinked, staring at him. "Do you?" His grip tightened around the glass. "I don't do regret." She tilted her head. "That's not an answer." He set the glass down with a quiet clink. "You didn't have to take this deal. You could have walked away." Emma swallowed hard. "And gone back to what? Sleeping on the streets, fighting for scraps?" "I didn't have a choice, Alexander." His jaw tensed. "I don't like that you think that." She frowned. "Why?" He finally looked at her, something dark and unreadable in his gaze. "Because I don't want to be your only option." Her breath hitched. For the first time since this arrangement began, he wasn't speaking as the businessman who had hired her. He wasn't the cold, detached CEO who orchestrated every move of his life. He was Alexander, the man beneath the mask, and that terrified her. Emma stood abruptly. "I should go back to bed." His gaze lingered on her, but he didn't stop her as she turned to leave. She told herself she was imagining things, that none of this meant anything, but deep down she knew she was in danger, not the kind she could run from, not the kind she could fight, the kind that came with feelings she wasn't supposed to have. The next morning, Emma tried to go back to pretending nothing had changed. She avoided Alexander as much as possible, keeping conversations short and interactions minimal. But avoiding him didn't mean avoiding reality. The headlines were everywhere. Alexander Grayson's fiancée. Who is Emma Carter? Mystery woman takes over the social scene. But what's her real story? Emma clenched her jaw as she scrolled through the articles. The media was obsessed with their engagement, analyzing her every move, speculating about her past. Some outlets praised her transformation, from nobody to billionaire's bride. Others weren't as kind. One headline made her stomach drop. From the streets to high society, the truth about Emma Carter. She clicked on it, her hands trembling. The article detailed her past, digging into everything she had fought to escape. Her mother's death, the debts, the eviction. They knew she had been homeless. Her heart pounded as she kept reading. The comments were worse. Gold digger. She must be blackmailing him. How long before he realizes he made a mistake? A cold chill ran through her. She had spent months crafting this image, playing the part. And now, in a single moment, it was all unraveling. "Emma," she looked up, startled. Alexander was standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "You saw it," she murmured. He didn't need to ask what she meant. He nodded once. "Yes." Her stomach twisted. "They know everything." He walked toward her, his movements controlled, careful. "It doesn't matter." She let out a bitter laugh. "Of course it matters. Your whole world is built on perception, right? What happens when they decide I don't belong in it?" He reached for her hand. She almost pulled away, but his grip was steady, grounding. "They don't get to decide that." She swallowed hard, her eyes searching his. "And you do?" His jaw tightened. "I do." Emma's pulse pounded. "Why?" For a moment he hesitated. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he said, "Because I don't see you the way they do." Her breath caught. This wasn't part of the deal. This wasn't supposed to happen. But as she stared into Alexander's unwavering gaze, she realized something terrifying. Neither of them were pretending anymore. Emma had spent weeks convincing herself this was all an act, that every stolen glance, every lingering touch, every moment that left her breathless was just part of the performance. But standing here with Alexander's gaze locked onto hers, she knew the truth. She wasn't pretending anymore. And neither was he. Her pulse hammered as the weight of his words settled over her. "Because I don't see you the way they do." What did that mean? How deep did this go? She should have asked, should have demanded an answer. Instead, she did what she had always done when things got too real. She ran. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving Alexander standing there. Her heart pounded as she hurried down the hall into the safety of her Bedroom. She shut the door behind her, pressing her back against it, sucking in a shaky breath. This wasn't part of the plan. She had agreed to play a role, to become Emma Grayson for 1 year. But now the lines were blurred, and she didn't know if she could untangle them before it was too late. She needed space. She needed out. Grabbing her coat, she slipped out of the penthouse before anyone could stop her. The cool air bit at her skin as she wandered the city streets, blending into the crowd. For the first time in weeks, she wasn't surrounded by flashing cameras or polished perfection. No designer dresses, no carefully scripted smiles. Just Emma. She found herself in front of an old bookstore tucked between two high-end boutiques. The sign above the door was faded, the windows slightly dusty. It looked out of place in this part of town, untouched by the wealth that surrounded it. Something about it felt familiar. She stepped inside, the scent of old paper and ink filling the air. A woman behind the counter glanced up. "Let me know if you need anything." Emma nodded absently, running her fingers along the spines of books. She didn't know why she was here. Maybe she just needed to be somewhere that didn't remind her of him. She picked up an old, worn-out novel and flipped through the pages, her mind racing. How had this happened? How had she gone from a girl barely surviving on the streets to this? Living in a penthouse, wrapped in silk, tangled in a life that wasn't hers. And worse, how had she allowed herself to want it? The bell above the door chimed. She glanced up and her breath caught in her throat. Alexander, dressed in his usual tailored suit, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. He had followed. Emma's grip tightened on the book. "How did you find me?" He stepped closer, his gaze steady. "You're not that hard to find." She swallowed, forcing herself to keep her voice steady. "I just needed some air." His jaw tensed. "You needed to run." She didn't deny it. He sighed, glancing around the store before turning his attention back to her. "If you want to leave, just say it." Emma's chest tightened. "It's not that simple." His gaze softened, just barely. "Isn't it?" She exhaled, setting the book down. This wasn't supposed to happen." His lips pressed into a thin line. "What wasn't?" She looked at him then, really looked at him. "This." She gestured between them. "Whatever this is." Silence stretched between them, heavy and unspoken. Then finally he said it. "I know." Emma's breath hitched. She should have been relieved, should have been grateful that he wasn't pretending anymore either. But instead she felt terrified, because if neither of them were acting, then what were they supposed to do now? She shook her head, stepping back. "We had a deal, Alexander." His eyes darkened. "I'm aware." "Then why are you looking at me like this?" He didn't answer, because they both knew the truth. The contract might still exist, but the rules no longer did. And if they weren't careful, this was going to become something neither of them were prepared for. Emma turned and walked past him, heading for the door. But before she could step outside, his voice stopped her. "Emma." She hesitated, glancing over her shoulder. His expression was unreadable, but his voice was different. "If you ever want out, tell me." Her fingers curled into fists. She should have said something, should have agreed, should have ended it right, then and there. Instead, she whispered, "I don't know what I want anymore." And then she walked away, leaving Alexander standing in the middle of a bookstore that suddenly felt too small for both of them. The tension between them became unbearable after that night. Emma tried to go back to how things were before, pretending that nothing had changed, that she hadn't seen the way Alexander looked at her. But it was useless. Every time they were in the same room, she could feel it. The weight of everything unspoken, the way the air seemed thicker, the way her pulse betrayed her. She didn't know how to stop it. She wasn't even sure she wanted to. But the worst part? Their 1-year contract was coming to an end, and with every passing day, the reality of what that meant loomed over her. The night of their anniversary arrived sooner than Emma was ready for. She sat at the vanity in her bedroom, staring at her reflection, her heart pounding. The dress Alexander had chosen for her was elegant, classic, nothing too flashy, nothing that screamed wealth. But she felt like an imposter wearing it. She swallowed hard. This was supposed to be the end. After tonight, they would finalize the divorce, and she would walk away, just like they had agreed, just like she had promised herself she would. A soft knock at the door made her jump. She turned, expecting a maid or a staff member, but when the door opened, it was Alexander. Her breath caught. He was in a black suit, perfectly tailored, but it wasn't the expensive fabric or the sharp cut that made her heart race. It was him, the way he looked at her, like he wasn't sure if letting her go was something he could actually do. Emma forced a smile. "Are you here to make sure I don't run?" His lips twitched. "Would you?" She looked away. "I don't." "No." He hesitated, then stepped inside. "You look beautiful." Her heart ached. "Don't say things like that, not now." She swallowed hard. "Alexander, we don't have to do this," he interrupted, voice quieter than she had ever heard it. Emma froze. "What?" His gaze locked onto hers. "The contract, the divorce, none of it. If you want to stay—" He trailed off. As if the rest of the sentence was too much to say out loud, her chest tightened. "You don't mean that." His jaw clenched. "Don't tell me what I mean." Emma's hands trembled in her lap. This was everything she had wanted to hear, everything she had been too afraid to admit she wanted. But it was too late. "You promised me a year," she whispered. "That's all this was ever supposed to be." His eyes darkened. "And what if I want more?" Emma felt something shatter inside her. She wanted more too. She wanted him. But this wasn't just about them. She was still the homeless girl who had walked into his world by accident. She would never truly belong here. The media, his business partners, the entire world would always see her as the woman who didn't, deserved to stand beside him. And one day he would see it too. Her voice broke as she whispered, "I can't stay." Alexander didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at her like he was trying to memorize every inch of her before she disappeared. Then, finally, he exhaled. "If that's what you want." Emma forced herself to nod. But as she walked past him, out of the room, out of his life, she realized something. She had just made the biggest mistake of her life. Months passed. Emma started over. Again. No penthouse, no designer dresses, no lavish parties. Just a small apartment, a steady job, a life that was real. But every night when the world was quiet, she thought about him. She thought about the way he looked at her, the way he almost asked her to stay. And she wondered, had she walked away from something real? One evening as she left work, she stepped onto the street, pulling her coat tighter around her. The city was as loud and chaotic as ever, but something felt off. A car was parked across the street, a sleek, black car. Her heart stopped. The door opened and out stepped Alexander. Emma froze. They stared at each other, the city blurring around them, the distance between them stretching painfully. She swallowed hard. "What are you doing here?" His jaw clenched. "I let you go once." Her breath hitched. "I'm not making that mistake again." Emma felt something inside her snap, and this time she didn't run. If this story resonated with you, please hit the like button to show your support. It truly helps me bring more impactful stories to you. If you haven't already, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss out on more emotional, thought-provoking tales. I'd really love to hear your thoughts. Comment below and share. What part of the story touched you most, or how it made you feel? Your feedback means the world and shapes the future of the channel. Thank you for being part of this community.